to this fantastic function. It's probably one of the best I've seen in London since I've been in and out of London for the last decade, and it's good to see so many people here. What I want to talk about today isn't necessarily just about Lenigas Cuba. It's about a number of experiences I've had here in London in the last couple of years, and some of the things that I think have changed my life, and also some of the investors' lives here in London. So, what's my slide say? Creativity, opportunity, and turning those opportunities into a reality. Well, system works. For those of you who don't read my blog, www.davidlenigas.com. I've been doing it since about October, November last year on advice from some quite senior people in the United States that said, you know, they think the world might be interested in some of the things that I'm interested in. And I put up there that it's free, because unlike a lot of other bloggers in the UK, you have to pay and subscribe and to support their lifestyles, but I do my blog for free, and I cover quite a lot of opportunities and things that sort of interest me, whether it's global, whether it's Cuba, whether it's the lithium market, whether it's you know, what you guys are going through here in the UK, because my wife's English, so it matters to me about what's happening here in the local environment. So if you get a spare moment, go and log in, click under subscribe, and you get it booted through every time I write one. I generally write one about twice a week on things that sort of interest me, and it's sort of being read quite widely these days in about 100 countries around the world. Pardon me. Right, this is a hands up time. All those people that live in the green area, stick your hand up. Okay. I'd just like to say that from my perspective, you've got oil underneath your backyard, and lots of it. And that green area represents the Weald Basin, which is about 1,260 square kilometres. In fact, the Weald Basin as a whole actually is about 1,500 to 1,800 square kilometres. But when I was sort of running UCOG, we were trying to piece it together. That sort of spun back to the 9th of April last year on the BBC, when we were talking about the potential of the Weald Basin to hold significant amounts of oil onshore UK with respect to how it could influence the way governments look at UK with respect to energy security, etc, etc, etc. And over the period of the last year, there's been a number of very large global groups that I've identified that at Horse Hill, which is the Gatwick gusher, that there's about 10 billion barrels oil in place. At the Horse Hill licence is 55 square miles. And if you look at the Weald Basin as a whole, there's about 124 billion barrels oil in place. Now the real trick is here, how much of that oil can actually be recovered. And there's been a lot of work go on since those numbers have hit the public marketplace, and a lot of toing and froing from the media and some bloggers, and there's been some great support from shareholders, and now we seem to be getting very good support from the government. But this was the beginning of a journey which I think will have a very big impact on the UK. Now, everyone calls it, in fact I think it was Alistair Osborne at the Times. I don't particularly like Alistair Osborne. I think he's a very bad journalist. I have a real issue with some of the journalists in this town, particularly Alistair Osborne at the Times, who still manages to keep his job. Andrew Critchlow at the Telegraph, who lost his job, and a few journalists at the Evening Standard who are no longer there, on the basis they thought the whole concept of the Gatwick gusher and the oil underneath Gatwick was all a bit of a joke, and this silly Aussie mining engineer could actually be so audacious to say, we've found oil underneath Gatwick. But just to give you an idea of how close the Gatwick gusher is to the Gatwick airport, you can see. And What I'd like to do is talk a couple of minutes about how I actually got involved, because not a lot of people know about this. There's a crazy South African called Jonathan Tidswell who went and had a cup of coffee with me at Franco's on German Street and said, would you like to go and drill a well at Gatwick Airport? And I said, you've got to be joking. You can't go drill a well there, you're going to get protested from here to Kingdom Come. And he said, no, we've got permission to drill it. So I said, all right, I'll come out and see you, I want to have a look at the site. So the next week he flew in from Edinburgh, because his wife's Scottish and his kids are Scottish, and I met him at Gatwick North Terminal car park at the coffee shop. So I'm sitting there in the Range Rover and I said, give me the postcode. Has it got a postcode to get to this joint? And I punched in the postcode and it said 1.2 miles to destination. And I said, Jonathan, there's no way anyone's ever going to let you drill a well 1 mile from Gatwick North Terminal. Everyone's going to freak out. So we drove out there. We pulled up on the side of the road, we jumped this barbed wire fence, and we walked down this little laneway, and over there was a field. He said, no, this is where we're going to drill the well, right in the middle of that. And I said, well, how are you going to stop the protesters? He said, well, we're a bit lucky because the side of the project sits right on the main highway, so they're not really going to be able to sit there and camp there. Now, obviously, over the last couple of months, we've found out that the protesters of the world can actually work out that they can camp anywhere they like, and the police seem to be quite amenable to letting them stay there. In fact, I even think the local council even put on porta potties for the protesters, which I know annoyed quite a few people. So then we're saying, okay, how much do you need to go and drill this well? Well, we've done all the numbers and it's about £3.4 million. I said, well, that's not a lot. I've got this little company called UCOG, UK Oil and Gas. I said, we could maybe fund some of this, but I'd have to bring in some of the other companies that sort of reside in my office to put together a consortium, because under the AIM rules, you can't invest too much in any one asset. So we started off with UCOG buying into the dream of, is there oil at Horse Hill? What particularly interested me was this was going to be one of the deepest wells to be drilled ever onshore UK. I mean, the original plan was to go down 9,000 feet. Now I thought, well, in America, a normal well's like 11 to 12,000 feet. But these guys are going, well, 9,000 feet is going to be the deepest well drilled onshore UK. That's a good promote. And when you do a lot of the work that I do, you need to have a story to get people engaged, otherwise people aren't terribly interested. And you need that story to be engaging because people need to give you money, because you can't go and build businesses on bottle tops and on a dream. You actually need to pay contractors with real money. So this is where it all started. And we drilled the well, and I was there on quite a number of days. And when we went through the Portland sandstone, which was the upper zone at the Gatwick Gusher, I physically saw the oil. So I'm going, this is really cool. We're going to have an oil strike here. Because there's a lot of people in the bloggers and the media going, yeah, they're never going to find oil. And I don't think I've drilled a well in my life around the world that hasn't hit oil. So when I saw the oil, I thought, this is all going to be pretty good. So, before I go to this slide, the real key to where this project changed was below the Portland. We were merrily drilling down through this, what we call the Kimbridge clay. Now the Kimbridge is what hosts all the oil in the North Sea. And I started seeing quite elevated gas readings. Now, for those of you who don't know much about oil and gas, and I'm just a dumb mining engineer, so my knowledge I've sort of learned from being with people, we started getting C1s to C5 gases. Now C1s to C3s are normal gas background, but when you get into the C4s and C5s, you're actually now starting to look into things like condensate, and condensate comes from oil. So I'm going, well, this is actually really quite odd. So we're getting quite excited. We had some pretty experienced guys there and said, look, this is interesting. We could be looking at an unconventional play. Now the word unconventional puts shivers amongst all the greenies amongst us, because they think, UK is going to be full of fracking, and and everyone's going to have contaminated water, and all the babies are going to end up with 4 arms. But we needed to keep an open mind that what we're looking at here is really a new oil system in the south of England that no one had found out. So then we drilled it, and then we waited for all the permissions to flow test the wells. And that took a hell of a long time. Anywhere else in the world, you'd be in there within 3 months, you'd flow test the well and move out. The problem with Britain today is bureaucracy kills most projects in the oil and gas front. And that has to change. And that was a lot of the rhetoric that the company's been going on with publicly about, guys, this is an important project for Britain. You need to be able to get the government to look at how to work with companies to encourage the concept of how to fast-track certain oil and gas exploration plays. Now, from when the discovery was made to when the oil flowed at Gatwick, there have been 3 international groups who've signed off on the potential of this project. NewTek, okay, no one here's heard of NewTek, but NewTek hold a database for the UK government. And NewTek is a very large global intelligence firm based out of Houston that most of the world majors know of or use. And they came up and said there's 9.2 billion barrels in the Horse Hill licenses and 124 billion barrels in the Wheel Basin. And of course, the media, who don't particularly like this project, started throwing mud again and saying, well, this is all bollocks. And I'm sitting there going, well, I couldn't give a rat's clacker what these media think. We're going to keep pushing on with the project. So I said to Steve Sanderson, who's now the chairman and CEO of UCOG, I said, we've got to get another independent international group. It's always good science to have 2 scientific opinions. So we got in Schlumberger. And Schlumberger did a work, because it was their logging equipment that went down the hole. Schlumberger did the work and said, well, okay, NewTek said about 10 billion barrels and Schlumberger going about 11 billion barrels. Now all of a sudden some of the media started to get a little bit interested that there's now 2 groups signing off. And last week, Ernst & Young did an economic evaluation on this project and worked out what the potential benefit of a project is like this for Britain. And I think that's where this whole project's been running all the way along. Why did I know there was oil there? This is the logs from Horse Hill, and this has been public since the 9th of April last year. So people can't say they didn't know there was oil because it was on UCOG's website. And if you look at the circle with the black bits in it, that's oil. And that's the upper Kimbridge limestone that flowed 900 barrels a day naturally to surface of oil that's better than North Sea Brent. And the second circle is what we call the oil in place. Now, that's a very interesting slide because look what's sitting right underneath it. We didn't even test that. We were struggling for time, budget and money. And there are a lot of zones in that Horse Hill 1 well that we never even tested. What we said was, okay, first of all, you've got to prove the concept. Is there flowable oil in Gatwick? And the answer is, absolutely. Now, we knew that the oil would flow from the Portland, but would the oil actually flow, or would it be too goopy from the Kimbridge limestones? And there was a risk of that. And even the big consultant said, look, we know the oil's there, but it might be too thick, it might be too bituminous. And from a technical perspective, Steve Sanderson and I are sitting there going, well, look, we'd actually be quite happy just to get a couple of barrels of oil to flow, but at least we could prove that the oil is mobile. So how are we going to justify that to the market when we actually flow test the Kimbridge limestones and we go, great, this was a fantastic technical success, but the flow rate was a barrel a day. And luckily it wasn't that. The oil is some of Britain's sweetest, finest crude, and it flowed merrily to surface without even a pump. And what a big benefit it is for the people here of the UK. So that's the flow test rig that was there for 5 weeks. It would have taken about 4, except some of our esteemed Green Party protesters decided that Britain needs to run on things like good wishes and windmills and wave farms, but unfortunately it's not reality in the world these days. Then there was a lot of comment about, oh yeah, but what about all this oil? There were 14 tankers of this oil that went to the refinery, and it's in a car that you drive. And we had 40 API oil, and Brent is 38, so it gives you an idea of the quality of it. But this is a phenomenal find. It's very real. All those bloggers and journalists who don't think this is real, it is. I can also tell you, and I'm not on the board of UCOG anymore, I thought I would put an Englishman in charge of an English project, because you can't have an Aussie, particularly with the sporting issues between cricket and rugby, etc., telling English that I found oil underneath Gatwick and you guys didn't. Because one thing that people don't understand is 86 wells have been drilled in the Wirral Basin over the last 100 years that actually hit this oil, and all those companies never bothered to analyse it. And it's only with 2014, 2015 technology that the oil was actually identified. But 86 wells have already been drilled into the Wirral Basin that hit this stuff. And it's all over the Wirral. And in fact, I wrote a blog the other month about, guys, there is probably oil underneath Big Ben, and there probably is as well. But the big hot spot for this oil, right in the sweet spot in south of England, is sitting right here. And let me tell you, the Isle of Wight is almost as good as well. So there's a lot of work to be done here, and I think UCOG, now I'm doing other things, has a lot of work to do, and it needs public support, and it needs shareholder support, and it needs shareholders to complain to the media regularly when they step out of line. Because frankly, I believe a lot of this media here is unregulated and should be held accountable. In fact, I think, when you look at some of the newspapers and some of the bloggers, I think they need to be held accountable by shareholders. I would even support a class action because they lost you money by convincing you this was all a whole lot of tripe, when in fact it was a whole lot of reality. So I think some of those people have a real big issue in their life. And guess what? There's not a frack inside. And that's what I love about this project even more. So I'm sitting there with Steve Sanderson. Steve, you're now the boss of UCOG. I want you to be the one talking to the government. I want you to be the one talking to number 10 Downing Street. This needs to be promoted by an Englishman. This needs to have an English board. You need English people to develop and promote this fantastic project. So I said, Steve, where would you go next? And he said, Dave, Cuba's that way. He said, there are 800-pound gorillas sitting in Cuba. And I've done a lot of work, and it sits right in the heart, and it's completely underexplored and underdeveloped. So I go, I like oil, I like working in developing countries. It's almost like Britain's a developing country when you look at the experiences of Horse Hill. So the first thing I got involved with was a little thing called Block 9 in Cuba. Now, Block 9 in Cuba isn't little. Block 9 is huge. It's actually bigger than the Wirral Basin. And this guy came in who I used to work with a long time ago in Italy and said, look, I've got an interest in this Block 9 and it should get approved. We've been waiting for it to be approved for 5 years. It's 2,400 square kilometres. And there's oil all over it. In fact, the oldest commercial oil field in the world sits in the middle of it, and it produced 5.6 million barrels in 1860 or something at 61 API oil. So I thought, well, I'll get involved in that. I'm going to form this company called Lenigas Cuba. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be a multi-strand conglomerate, and I'm going to work out how does a public company, the first ever public company in the world, look at investing in a communist country like Cuba that's obviously going through some transformational processes in its life. And those have issues, and we're going through those issues. But this is a slide that came up from MEO Australia, the people who actually hold the license. I go, this was actually public last Friday. Now, if you look at the size of the elephants here, you've got the, what's it called, the Varadero field. It's run by Sherritt Gordon. Sherritt's a big Canadian company, produces 26,000 barrels a day, 11 billion barrels oil in place. Now, how many of those other blue targets look about that size? lots of them. And there's been 17 wells drilled on Block 9 while the whole country's been in communist mode. And at the end of June, and this is not insider information, we're going to release the size of the resource and the recoverable reserves on Block 9, and I can tell you it's going to be off the clock. And because of our effort in dealing with the Cubans and what we're looking at doing and supporting the oil and energy industry in Cuba, we are getting phenomenal support from the Cuban government, not only for this project, but for all the other projects that the LGC is doing in the country. So why is energy important? The US Geological Survey say that the northern part of Cuba has 4.6 billion barrels of recoverable reserves. Cuba's been embargoed by the United States since 1962, and no one's done any modern day exploration. And now that the exploration work is starting, Cuba will become an oil powerhouse in that part of the world. So we're very comfortable with that. Cuba currently produces about 80,000 barrels a day, all onshore. That's 4 times the size of Britain's onshore production. Each well averages about 3,000 barrels a day. And Cuba imports half of its oil from Venezuela, and Venezuela's obviously got some political and financial issues which they need to address, and the Cubans are getting very worried about energy supply because they have a 150,000 barrel a day refinery that they need to power their economy and their power stations in the country. So we're quite excited about that. Now, and I've done this in Africa and I've done this in a number of other countries. You can't just get involved in a project that's a single project company. I mean, right now, if I wanted to talk to you about oil and gas, you'd all be asleep because the oil and gas price is horrible and everybody's going broke and governments are going broke. So what we decided to do with Lenigas Cuba was multi-strand investment. We wanted to demonstrate to the world that we can actually buy and sell businesses, participate in business development, grow into businesses in Cuba. And now we're operating in the oil and gas sector, tourism sector, import sector, human resources. We're looking at getting involved in technology, real estate, sports, and consulting. And that all within 6 months. And I can tell you from someone who's working on the ground, it is almost impossible to do business in Cuba. Everybody thinks that, wow, the Americans are changing their stance on Cuba. Most of the people who invest in Cuba aren't Americans. The Americans say, I'll sell you chickens, but give me $600 million in cash first, and I'll send the chickens. It's the Europeans, it's the Middle East, it's the Asians. Air China is now flying 3 direct flights a week as of the 28th of December to Havana. They're full. You try and get on Virgin Atlantic from Gatwick to Havana, it's full. You try and get on Iberia or Air France or KLM, they're full. The airport can't handle it anymore. Tourism has now grown tremendously. I mean, last year was a record year of 3.5 million people. I mean, this is a record year even before the embargo, when Havana was like Monaco on steroids before the embargo. The country is booming, but it needs foreign investment to help cope with the way the world is changing. So Lenigas Cuba works with partners and partners with people already doing business with Cuba. That's the shortcut to investing. So many people go to Cuba and try and do a deal and get kicked out because the government doesn't like them, or the government said this is not good for Cuba. So pretty well every deal we do in Cuba is supporting financially companies that are already well entrenched and doing well. And what we try and do is create and identify opportunities with rapid growth potential. So that's our website. We've got to be careful because everything we put out on the public arena is read by the Cuban government. This is like being in the Soviet era 20, 30 years ago. And that is a fact of life. And people who don't understand that, it's their country, it's the way they do business. But I wanted to put this slide on because Patrick Brearley from ISDX presented earlier about my frustrations of the ISDX market. We listed on ISDX on the 2nd of November. I was going to keep it private for a while. I looked at AIM and I looked at the LSE main board standard list. The problems with those two listings is Cuba in the name or Cuba in the business. It is impossible for banks in the UK or Europe, and it is illegal for them to do that, is to stop people investing in Cuba who are European based. But they say from a business perspective, I don't want to touch it. It is every transfer that we try and do around the world is held up by OFAC, which is the US government, and money is stuck in cyberspace until you can work out how to get it back. And that's the same issue with the exchange. It got to the point with the London listing, UKLA, they said, well, okay, if I want to go buy a coffee shop for $50,000, they said, that's fine, but you'd have to suspend and do a reverse document for £500,000. And I thought, you know what, I don't want to do that. But what I do want to do is get it listed on a regulated platform as soon as possible, because the Cuban government seriously appreciate the fact that we're listed, we're regulated, and we're a reporting entity, and that makes us real. Everyone else that goes into Cuba sits there thinking it's Gunslingerville, and that's what I think differentiates us from a lot of other people who are looking at investing in Cuba. So we bought into a travel business in Cloud9. Toby Brocklehurst's been there 25 years. We look after some of the richest billionaires in the world. We like bespoke travel. We bring them in, VIP service through the airport, we get them hotels, we get them apartments, we give them drivers, we get them into the best restaurants, we take them on fishing trips, you name it. I mean, some of the people we take in, if I told you who they were, I'd have to shoot you because of the confidentiality. But this business is just growing bananas. I mean, it's already a multi-million-dollar business, and I see huge potential for Cloud9 and Travel Welcome Group over the next year or two. We bought into a company called Cuba Professionals. Cuba Professionals hires out Cuban artists to the world. It generates Cuban domestic income. The Cirque du Soleil circus, the Cubans in that, we supply them. Cuban dance groups and bands on cruise ships, we supply them. We help Cuban artists move to the world, and we show off Cuban art and culture to the world. And that's one of the things we do. We own 50% of this business. One of the things I think that's probably going to grow the quickest, with the exception of oil, is what's happening with the trading side of the business. Cuba imports 70% of everything it consumes. And that is principally due to the embargo from the United States government. And the other problem with Cuba is they don't have any money to pay for it. They would need it, they want it, but you know, they've got one of the great education systems, healthcare systems. So there's a real balancing act on how the Cubans can afford to pay to bring in product. And we've partnered with a Canadian company called Groombridge Trading, run by an English guy. He needed to go through Canada because it's about the only country in the world you can actually move money in and out of Cuba with without the Americans giving you a hard time. You can go and buy as many Cuban cigars in Toronto as you want. And up until a month ago, you couldn't buy any Cuban cigars in America. Now I think you can buy 3, and that's your limit. But we see huge opportunities here. We've got millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of import contracts from all over the world, ranging from things like paints to gym equipment to minibar fridges to food to construction material that we're working through importing into Cuba, backed by a number of foreign governments from a payment terms perspective, but everything in Cuba takes time. So we see this business as growing very quickly. Now things are changing in the public's mind. You know, the Pope's been there, Obama's been there. And one nice thing about President Obama being to Cuba is the roads are better and the internet worked a bit better for the week. But everything's now got a lick of paint. The bitumen along the main streets is better. And frankly, if you really look at the way Cubans think about the meeting, Raul Castro wasn't even there to meet Obama when he flew in. He was happy sitting there waving goodbye. Castro, old man Castro, Fidel, the father of the country, he didn't even bother to meet him. There was a whole lot of rhetoric and handshaking, but nothing has physically changed. What people have to understand is Cuba is still in a full US embargo. and Cuba is still a communist country. And Cuba, in their mind, are proud of their culture, whether we agree with their politics or whatever. That's their country, their business. Things are going to take a long time to change in Cuba, and there's no way Cuba ever wants to become just merely another state of South Florida, and that is never going to happen. But that's the opportunity. So, a week and a half ago, President Obama, 2-3 days in Cuba, bye-bye. Has anything changed? No. In fact, I had a meeting with the Vice President of the country last week, Vice President Cabrusos, for 2 hours. And about half an hour of that discussion was discussing about, because I was bringing some Middle East, very big heavyweights, talking about what possibilities there are to assist the Cubans with respect to infrastructure building. The Cuban government still cannot transfer money in US dollars like President Obama said he could. They're still trying. They're waiting. But until such time as key things like fiscal constraint and the embargo are seriously broken by Congress in the United States, I don't think you're going to see things change. But the business opportunities in Cuba are vast if you know how to do it. So what are we? We're first mover advantage, we're public listed, we're fully accountable, we do a lot of business in Cuba, we're looking at buying into a lot of businesses in Cuba. Things take longer than you think. What are we focusing on? We're focusing on some big sports initiatives which will become public in the next week or two, probably Monday or Tuesday. Retail. There is a drastic need for retail. All the shops in Cuba are supermarkets owned by various government chains. We've been asked to set up a number of retail opportunities in Cuba on behalf of the government, and we're looking very seriously at that. Food. Food is a big issue. If you want to go to a restaurant in Cuba 2 years ago, it wasn't worth it. You tried to go into your hotel because at least they could get decent food in on a container. You go to there's 500 entrepreneurial licenses in Cuba now. The restaurants are off the clock. The decor's fantastic. The mojitos are good. The rum's fantastic, and the food's fantastic. Things are starting to move, but they need people bringing in good food product, wine product, normal, sustainable stuff that's not chickens from America or mini meal from South America. But things are changing. The internet's getting better. When I first went to Cuba, I was going to one of these new hotspots at 1 megabit a second download. It was 10 cooks or 10 euros an hour. It's now 2 cooks an hour, and there's lots of them. All the hotels have Wi-Fi. It's amazing. You can even use WhatsApp, Skype. Things are changing. And that's one of the things that's going to seriously empower Cuba to deal with its way and finding its way in the world, and it's really exciting. One of the things I don't know what's going to happen is when Google send up these 7,000 balloons in about a year's time, and a whole heap of them are flying over Cuba, because their Google plans to give the world free internet within about a year to a year and a half. Now that could really stuff up the Cuban government, but I'm quite excited about it because you'll be able to have internet all over Cuba. And infrastructure, and we're looking at bringing in some very large global groups on building some big infrastructure jobs that the Cubans need in the country. They need $2.6 billion worth of infrastructure build every year to keep up with their pace. And Cuba is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. I mean, the IMF say that Cuba should have GDP growth for the next decade in excess of 4%. Tourism growth is phenomenal. And that's the opportunity. So what I'm saying is, buyer beware, do your own research, come on the journey. And those who know me in this room know that I don't stop until I finish. I'm not happy with the way the ISDX market works. You've got to get on the phone and call a broker. People have forgotten how to do that. People are lazy these days. They want to sit in their office or at home, trade online and get leverage online. But ISDX, I've been told, will change. ISDX will go online trading, and if it doesn't, I'm going to grab Patrick by the throat and bash him against the wall in the next few weeks, because he's promised it to me and a number of other companies, regularly in the last few months. But I know they're working hard to get it. But I'm also going to be listing in North America, because North America everyone will be able to trade online. The Americans will be able to trade us, and I'm very excited about what's going to happen. So I see the opportunity in getting involved in a company like LGC is now and in the growth phase. And when we do position ourselves as a listing in North America, I think, with the uniqueness of what we're doing, I think there's going to be a lot of interest. And I see phenomenal growth opportunities from here. I mean, we only listed on the 2nd of November. I mean, what are we into it? 6 months in. We're literally doing an acquisition every week or two, and they're all principally related to cash flow type businesses. What are we in Cuba? We're a bank. We're a bank that's empowering local entrepreneurs and people who've been in the country to grow their business, because in Cuba you can't get a bank loan. And if you're a Spanish company who operates Cuba professionals, you're not going to get a Spanish bank loan to do business in Cuba. And that's what we do. So ladies and gentlemen, there's a number of opportunities here. There's some great companies being presented to, particularly all the horse hill companies, which I'm quite fond of. And one other final parting word is that the Prince's Trust has a booth 34 and 35, and I'm a great supporter of what Prince Charles does. Since the trust started 40 years ago, he's helped 800,000 British young kids and people try to sort of plot their path through life a little bit better. They're selling a few things down there, some chocolates and some trinkets, so it'd be really good, if people could go a little bit outside the main corridor and go visit the Prince's Trust booth. I'm certainly going to buy some of that honeycomb chocolate on the way home. But now, thank you very much for listening. And as most people know, I'm available on the phone. Call the office. If I can't take your call, it's because I'm travelling or I'm busy. Just leave a message. I will eventually get back to you. I do communicate with retail. I do communicate with institutional shareholders, and I will call you back. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a great day here. This is a fantastic show.